Someone is wrong. The blood starts to boil, thank you. The vein starts to throb, and emotion totally overwhelms you, and you end up screaming and shouting or typing ferociously on the keyboard because some annoying person on the internet somewhere is wrong. This talk is, the real name of this talk is Rhetoric for Programmers. But I've already had to sell this talk to the conference organizers and to all you guys who have come here. So I needed something more emotive, something that kind of triggered something with everyone and made people think maybe of XCD comics. What is rhetoric? Well, rhetoric really consists of two aspects. There's different definitions of like big rhetoric and little rhetoric. It's actually a bit of a overly kind of generalized word, but for the purpose of this, we're going to talk about big rhetoric. And this covers discourse and persuasion. And that can be over writing, that can be speech, any different type of medium you could think of, writing a letter. And the motivation for this talk came about. I was working for a company that was moving from PHP to Ruby. And I used to get these panicked emails from the founder of the company where someone wrote a blog post, I think, saying like why after like a year or two of using Rails, I switched back to PHP. And I kind of got these things thrown at me aggressively, and I was like, ah. And I had to kind of take that blog post and go, okay, like let me read through that quickly. Let me identify like what actually are his core points. Kind of build up, some logical argument that I could bring then to my boss and say like, don't worry, he's got some good points, but he's not thought about this, he's not thought about that. And I kind of realized this is really what a lot of rhetoric is about having to convince someone. And I really feel that's kind of key. We'll see throughout this talk of software development and how rhetoric to me is fundamental to writing good software. I don't want to give you the impression, rhetoric has been fairly abused by politicians. So you take a turd and you add rhetoric, it is still a turd. There's no snakeskin here, or snakeskin oil. So let's start where I'm sitting here now, the rhetorical situation, where I sit trying to talk to you about something. And as I said, this is about persuasion and discourse. So I have an agenda. I have something I believe that is good for you guys. I think rhetoric is something you should know. But that's probably a little negative way of phrasing it. I'm implying something you don't have. And negative emotions are much less persuasive than positive ones. So maybe if I reframe that, I think knowing rhetoric will help make you a better programmer. Now, who would not want to be a better programmer? We're all here to kind of grow and learn. It's something we all want. So maybe rhetoric can help you do that. This also kind of sparked off something I noticed in a lot of companies I'd worked in, where I saw a lot of really smart developers with really great ideas and kind of come to this collision of discussion of people arguing or trying to persuade each other about which way this architecture should be designed, which system should be here over there. And I kind of saw quite scarily frequently, these very smart people who I'd spoken to like individually had these great ideas. They had the great ideas, but they didn't have the right words. They didn't have the convincing words. And this kind of loudest voice tended to win these discussions. And this scared the crap out of me. It was like, I can see these really smart people not getting the chance to have their inputs, their opinion, their ideas come through. So really, almost my agenda is to try and help at least give some insight into how rhetoric can play a part of this and know when it's being used against you and how to use it yourself. So all good stories start with the Greeks. I want to focus on one very specific aspect. I'm not going to get too deep into Greek mythology. The Greeks had this wonderful thing they used to do. You can imagine a Greek library. When anyone read a book in this library, the Greeks believed you should read out loud. You can kind of imagine the absolute chaos there must have been in that library. But they did this because they were scared of losing their ability to talk, discuss, persuade. They felt if they read in their head, they wouldn't be able to have as much skill in discourse. And the Greeks really believed, along with the whole athleticism, that rhetoric, that being able to talk about your ideas and discuss and be persuasive, was kind of the ideals of like the perfect Greek kind of role model, I guess. Ooh. And I find this interesting looking at software development. I can, when I first started coding, I could quite happily spend an entire day and not talk to a single person. I would sit there in my own head, and I'd be thinking through my code, and I'd be quite happy listening to my music, and I would go through and I would hack out code after code. And then I kind of, going back to this idea of like practicing speaking is actually a useful way of developing our skills for discourse, and also, in fact, for actually thinking about things. It helps to actually verbalize things. It's kind of part of the thought process. And we look at something like pair programming, which came along. It's like, okay, maybe if I have to explain to a pair what I'm doing as I'm going through, I'm practicing my discourse skills. There's also an aspect of persuasion there. I'm like, maybe we should use a mock there. Oh, no, I don't think there's a mock there. Maybe we should use a stub. And there's lots of little discussions in discourse. It's a way of developing and practicing speech. And retrospectives, rather than ignoring the past, everyone comes together and discusses it, talks about the things they've learned, the things they could do better. Conferences. If you just go over to kind of the sponsor rooms or just have a look around this place, there is lots and lots of things trying to persuade you. There's lots of advertising trying to persuade you. There's lots of talks. You know, I have an agenda. I've already told you I think rhetoric is something useful for you. I have an agenda in this conference. It's very, very rare that you kind of get one of those absolute pure technical ones, which doesn't have any level of personal input or personal slant about, you know, our company did this. Even if that person is projecting that as, this is just one example of how our company did it. They have a level of authority because they're standing on a stage in front of you telling you this. So you go away and say, well, they did that. Maybe we should do that. It goes even further with open source is a fun one. I do a lot of open source projects. And it's funny how rhetoric comes into play in just submitting a ticket for a feature. So I do a lot of work on Cucumber. And you know, when someone submits a feature to me, it's often like, this would be really cool if you could do this. And I'm like, well, like, why? Like, could you explain to me that? Like, persuade me why this is a good feature. And in fact, like submitting these tickets, making feature requests, there's aspects of code there as well to help provide persuasion. But there's a lot about trying to persuade someone, this is a good feature for your tool. And the kind of tech choices, all the various tech choices you face, all have aspects of rhetoric, all have nice, shiny websites that are trying to persuade you that they are the right tool. Talking about rhetoric, I have to address something Facebook released in their, when they released their IPO. They had this kind of big, long document, and one of the things they talked about was that kind of as engineers, rather than spend days and days kind of debating things, it should be the code that wins the argument. And this is a great idea. Like, I completely am on board with it. I think code is a form of rhetoric. It's a form of persuading people about a specific way of solving a problem is the right way to solve it. But it misses some of the aspects. I think it's naive to assume that code can solve all arguments in our work. One specific example, I had two developers kind of managing their own little teams. And each of them had a very opinionated view about how the system should be designed. And this was around the time that Facebook did this. And I was like, OK, I'll fall for the fact that Facebook is an authority and just try and see what happens and do what they do. And so these teams went off. They spent a couple of days hacking away. They came back together, kind of sat in front of each other's code, and then continued to argue about the fact, no, that's not the right way to do that. You shouldn't do that. And again, the code did not capture everything that each person was trying to express. That's because code doesn't necessarily capture all the swearing, all the raising your head in the air, all the like beauty moments where you're like, that's amazing sort of thing. Code isn't exactly a method of capturing everything that goes into actually producing the code. And the fact that there are things that are just, you know, complicated, like should we use a service-oriented architecture here? How should we do this? Often it kind of comes down to someone just strongly saying, yes, I think this is right, and not necessarily having kind of the right argument to actually make that decision. More the fact that it's better to take action than do nothing. So I think it's wrong to say code wins arguments. It's communication wins arguments. And code is a form of communication, a form of rhetoric. So in Facebook, in many ways, is right, but misses out the kind of the aspect of somehow we can remove communication from our process. As I was kind of saying, code is a form of rhetoric. Alistair Cockburn, who's written a whole bunch of things on the early days of Agile and XP and extreme programming, had this nice definition of something called a rhetorical programming language. And it was this exact thing I just mentioned. He felt programming languages just didn't capture kind of everything that was going on in the programmer's brain as they were writing that code. And kind of as someone new coming to a piece of code, it's like, the code is actually persuading me that was the right way to approach the problem. Am I just going to refactor it? Am I going to say, yeah, they solved that way and effective? So his idea, again, was kind of, you know, you should be able to shout. You should be able to, like, have emoticons. And if you look at GitHub and look at some of the comments on various open source projects, like, the most common thing is someone having a line and just having a little smiley saying, yep, that's great, that's brilliant. It's another way of capturing some of the ideas and communication that go into writing code. Hello World is my favorite example as coder's rhetoric. So everyone knows the Hello World program, the first one you ever write that proves that a computer can print standard out or some wonderful graphical user interface. But it actually took a while for Hello World to come about. If you look at the very first programming languages that published, 1945, Fortran, Lisp Basic from 1957 to 1972, the first examples of these programming languages were like solving differential equations, solving mathematical problems. It's because the code was functioning as a form of rhetoric, but it was about saying this programming language is actually useful. You can solve real problems. In the early days of programming, it wasn't just saying like, here it is, go do your thing. It was like, yes, this is a real, it's not a toy. You can actually solve things. And in fact, it took actually quite a long time for this Hello World to come about. It was in this great book called My Computer Likes Me When I Speak in Basic. And the very first example, in fact, wasn't a Hello World. It was a My Human Understands Me. The kind of key, again, like a transition here is it's stating something very different. The code is actually, again, trying to persuade us, but it's now, rather than trying to say this code is actually really useful, it's saying this language is really intuitive for a human to write. You will find this very easy to write. Look how easy it is. I can understand what that means. Your computer can understand what that means. So again, it's like a transition in our progression of programming languages, that this new example. And then we look at like lots of other frameworks, like Node.js and some of the testing frameworks. Now it's very common to have a little kind of 3 or 4 line snippet of an example of, say Sinatra. Look how amazingly simple it is to create this framework, create a little web app. It's saying, look, not how easy it is to express, but look how concise it is. Look how simple it is. Look how little you have to write. Talking about Ruby, it's kind of hard not to look at Rails, in that Rails was definitely an aspect of persuading people to use Ruby. At this time, I was looking between working with Python and working with Ruby. And to me, both programming languages I actually really liked. I thought they were both fairly equal, both different nuances, but I really liked them both. So what made me kind of decide that, yeah, this team should probably go away and use Ruby and Rails was actually sitting through watching some of the blog posts that DHH did of like, look how easy it is, look how simple it is to write a blog. Again, that blog kind of like screencast was actually a form of rhetoric convincing us not just that Ruby was useful, but look how kind of concise and simple and elegant it was. So I think a large aspect in programming languages and technology that kind of give this promotion is not just necessarily the technical aspects, but also the ability to promote it and persuade people it's a good tool to use. I mean, this is kind of like full of so much rhetoric. Web development that doesn't hurt. Would anyone want to do web development that hurt? No, that's ridiculous, right? Get excited, get started, get better. These are all positive emotions, more likely to convince us that this is a good idea. Oh, sorry. So Aristotle wrote a great book on, well, great, written in Greek, so it's very long and tedious, but it is very interesting, on the art of rhetoric. And we're just going to go into some of the ideas he had, because there's a lot of useful things in there. He categorized this into 3 different types of rhetoric. An argument by character. This is completely in your guys' domain, how you judge me. What sort of character do I come across? Am I convincing? Am I trustworthy? Argument by logic, kind of the logic of your reasoning, your evidence, sort of thing that actually programmers are quite good at. Humans aren't good at it, so there's a subset there of issues. And argument by emotion, probably the most, I'd say the most evil potentially, but actually I'm going to show you a bunch of examples that are being used in programming for the greater good. The Greeks gave these funny little names like pathos, logos, and ethos, but we'll stick with emotion, logic, and character. As I said, logic, I think, is something we're quite good at. It kind of comes down to like how clear your evidence is, the logic of your reasoning. It can be very considered mathematical. What I really want to focus on, because each of these topics is a vast book in itself and hours of presentations, is the thing that we're really bad at. The logical fallacies, the mistakes that we make. False logical conclusions. There's a great list of all these various fallacies. And lots of people have taken, political blog posts, programming blog posts, and picked out and actually analyzed it and identified each of the fallacies. This is one of my favorites. This was an article about how Node.js is a cancer. It was quite a vitriolic blog post. And in one of his examples, his reason for why Node is a terrible idea is this JavaScript example he created. worst thing you could ever be written in JavaScript. So he picks this horrible, hideous example. He's showing that in any programming language, you can create something that is so horrific and horrible, it's very easy to attack. So this is the example of the straw man fallacy, where you have an issue like Node.js, and that's a vast thing, right? We can't all discuss and process that. So we have to kind of break that down to some smaller aspect. But then the danger is actually reducing it to some stupid example in JavaScript, which I could take any programming language and write something that was absolutely hideous and would be very easy to attack. I've created a straw man. It's also an example of misleading vividness. This is used a lot by politicians when they're talking about the negative aspects of some, I guess, some policy or something. They describe in vivid detail exactly what's going to happen in this horrible bad case, irrelevant of the fact that it's going to be a tiny, tiny percentage of, I don't think anyone would actually ever write that JavaScript. It's an example that's kind of very vivid, but actually doesn't represent percentage-wise how many people would write it. Everyone should recognize the wonderful fail whale. So I forget how long ago this was now. It was probably a couple of years back, where there was some, I guess, sounds in the community that Twitter was having problems scaling Rails. And this kind of really led to a lot of the spotlight fallacy of saying, well, Twitter, which I'm going to hazard a kind of guess is probably in terms of traffic is unlike anything anyone else will experience but someone like Google or Facebook. So this is a huge, huge kind of edge case sitting on our graph. But lots of people took this and extrapolated. Because Twitter can't handle a massive amount of scale, hence Rails does not scale, right? I mean, taking it into a generalization which actually misses the nuances of the problem. The fact is that Rails can and does scale. It's just in that specific example there are problems. This is probably the most dangerous form of rhetoric, and it's a really hard one to kind of deal with. So the fact is you can't consume all information and gather all the research yourself. So you need to listen to people who are more experienced, people who consider themselves experts, explain to you about ideas. But if your rationale for why you should do something is because X, DHH said that you should not use Cucumber, hence no one should ever use Cucumber. That misses the kind of understanding. You should be able to say, you should not use Cucumber because, and you should be able to list those reasons why that's bad, not the fact that just someone in authority told you it was a bad idea. So I'm kind of sitting in front of you here telling you rhetoric is useful. But in fact, I don't want you to believe me just because I'm on the stage talking to you. In fact, what I'd rather have is each of you kind of come up to me afterwards and persuade me using rhetoric that rhetoric is a bad idea. And that's good for me. I'm happy. Yeah, so it's called appeal to authority. This is a very common one that I'm kind of reckon a lot of people have experienced. This idea you've invested so much in a project, it's too late to go back. It's too expensive, it's too hard to go. This actually comes from economics as well, this idea of the sunk cost fallacy. It relies on the fact that humans have this thing called loss aversion. We actually value loss far higher than we do any positive gain. And in this exact example, I was trying to convert these people from PHP to Ruby, and it was kind of like, we've sunk so much time and effort and expertise into this language. We shouldn't consider this option that actually will be a better solution for us and will actually enable us to move faster because we're so stuck in this problem. I think this is something that's fairly common in programming as well. Like, it's always kind of fun seeing very experienced programmers where they just do a git reset hard and throw away the last hour of work. And you're like, whoa, what did you just do? That was like an hours of work. It's that loss aversion again, is the fact that actually throwing away the code can be a very useful thing to do to start fresh. So logic is great, but if you want to have a discussion around any topic, around mocks or something, or Rails or scaling, it's important, and it's the common mistake of kind of assuming you could just go to a meeting, a discussion with people, and just expect to be able to reel out all the great ideas. If you want to kind of argue why mocks are a bad idea, you should know all the reasons why mocks are a good idea, and you should understand those. Knowing both those arguments, which I think is where often kind of expertise comes from, and having all experience and having sit on the fence where you think mocks are good, then they're bad, then they're good, then they're bad, kind of gives you a good perspective on being able to discuss why they might be a good example, or why they might be good in some example. Emotion is one of my favorite aspects of rhetoric. It's a metaphor. Metaphors used to try and create some sort of shared connection between us. Metaphors can create something we can visualize. If we can kind of create that thing and we can both have that shared vision, then that connects us as a group, me the presenter and you as the audience. And I want you all to feel I'm one of you because you're more likely to listen to me, more likely to be convinced by me if you consider me one of you. If you think about this presentation in terms of storytelling, I've explicitly, I think, list 2 or 3 stories now. These stories haven't just been there for random chance. These stories have been specifically there to try and create some shared connection between us. I'm kind of hoping someone somewhere has gone like, oh man, that PHP project sort of thing. And by having that shared emotion, again, you're more likely to listen to me, you're more likely to be persuaded by me. And passion in delivery, I hope, despite terrible jet lag and being slightly ill, that I'm demonstrating a tiny bit of passion. So one of the really great research papers that I think is a great example of this emotional aspect of rhetoric is this paper called The Big Ball of Mud. And at the time, I was working on a really horrible legacy code base. And this kind of paper is full of all these anti-patterns of design. And they kind of, they described them in great example. They gave bits of code to show you. And, they really kind of caught me. I was like, yeah, that's exactly the problem I'm facing. But before each of these patterns, they picked these little pictures to try and kind of express a level of kind of emotional aspect, a level of storytelling to this pattern. And this pattern perfectly summed up what I was feeling about my architecture. This ginormous shovel of I don't even know what that is, just lumped into another hideous pile of stuff. Feeling like Gulliver's Travels being tied down and everyone roped you down. These patterns as they were written were, they were great in themselves, but using this kind of emotional aspect really triggered something in my mind. It made me remember these things. It really kind of touched something that it wasn't just a written description. It was exactly how I felt about this specific code base. Jim Wilk did in his talk, Polite Programmer. This came up from an IRC conversation, I think, where someone said that every time you test the private method, you kill a unicorn. Now, this is perfect, right? You take an animal which doesn't exist, and for some reason, there's one of them, who in this room would willingly want to kill that unicorn, right? There's an emotional, oh, thank you. There was someone who wanted to actually kill the unicorn. I admire you. So, again, it's using emotion to try and convince you that testing private methods is a bad idea. We'll see this all over the place. Every time you break the bill, God kills a kitten. Who would want to kill kittens? Again, an emotional argument. Who would want Darth Vader staring down at them, looking at their lack of tests? This one came up, and by using swearing in any sort of statement, we convey more emotion, more passion. It's not just about testing, it's about much more kind of emphasis on it's really, really massively about testing. And this kind of kicked off in the Ruby community, at least lots of people saying yeah, I'm going to do this, I'm going to test all the time, this is great. Kind of using emotion into this. It's not like people hadn't talked about TDD before. You looked at Cunningham's sort of stuff where he was testing TVs and doing loads of crazy stuff. He was testing absolutely everything, and it was very scary but cool. So I really feel this is actually kind of actually a negative thing for the community, and this kind of emotional persuasion of yeah, this is so great, we should test absolutely everything. This is very passionate. Miss the kind of concept of actually thinking all the time and not being blindly kind of cargo culted into doing something just because you feel like it's convincing because of the emotional aspect. This comes from a really interesting website I recommend you check out called Quotes of Contempt. Don't worry about all the text here, I'll read a little bit out. This came up in a discussion about XML, where someone was saying, basically XML is just another way of writing S expressions or trees or whatever you want to call it. And Eric Nagum wrote this incredibly, emotionally loaded response. And this is a perfect example of using emotion in your argument. So he goes on to say that, XML and expressions are not identical. Robbery is not just another way of making a living. Rape is not just another way of satisfying basic human needs. Torture is not just another way of interrogation. And XML is not just another way of writing S expressions. I mean, ouch, right? That's... the guy just never responded. You couldn't, right? I think he's just, again, it's an interesting example. I think it's perhaps an extreme example, but it is using emotion to try and convince, to try and express an idea. I often think the phrase code smells is not the right it doesn't quite fit for me. I think about smells, and I don't think about going near smells. Smells make me go away from them. If you look at this code, just kind of see what emotion is hiding in there, how they make you feel. This history, backported changes, we're not in CSV, please somebody shoot us and put us out of our misery, right? Like that conveys like a lot of, as I was saying, this whole like rhetorical language. There's a lot of like emotion in there in the comments about expressing how hideous this code is. This public method, which is for class internal use only, that just makes me feel very sad. And this little bit of Ruby, these are all from open source projects. Like, how does that code make you feel? I still don't really understand what it is or what it does. It's just, oh, it's horrible.
It's a very negative process.
Yeah. So we're talking about emotions, so we should also talk about going too far, I guess. So the kind of the emotional part of the brain can actually override the logical part. And you can kind of get into this dangerous thing. It's very interesting seeing little children do this. Children are the master of emotional persuasion, of seeing them saying, like, if you love me, you'd buy me that ice cream. It's a great example. But there's this kind of aspect where emotion overrides, and even if you're having a logical discussion, it's that seeing red, I guess. There are kind of 2 points with this I kind of want to bring. There's a lot of research suggesting that if we can learn and understand better our emotions, that's the sort of thing that once you've learned, sticks with you for your life. If you can kind of get better at identifying when you're starting to go into that red, this is not possible for everyone. This is very, very hard to do. But that journey towards that is a valuable journey of being able to understand and better recognize your own emotions. And also knowing when to step away from a discussion when you're trying to persuade someone. This is just not going to go anywhere productively. You're stuck in this kind of emotional enragement. Character is the final, I guess, the topic of rhetoric. So Aristotle, again, decides these themes of credibility and authority, that you, the audience, have, again, complete control over this. Like, how much credibility in what I'm saying do you have? And authority is like, I'm no expert in rhetoric. I've gone and done a bunch of research. I hope that implies some authority of the stuff that I've learned that I'm conveying to you. He further went to subdivide these into the kind of 3, I guess, characteristics. The virtue of the speaker, we're more likely to be persuaded by someone we consider virtuous. Selflessness or disinterest. Excuse me, this is interesting. If you think about how many presentations you see with giant company logos in the corner, or like their first slide is the ginormous logo, you'll notice I have not mentioned whatsoever who I work for, anything, because that has absolutely no relevance to what I'm talking to you about. Again, that level of like being selflessness and kind of just really not caring about all the politics and actually just trying to convey stuff to you is very persuasive. Practical wisdom is kind of a fun one. This is often actually about breaking the rules, about having the experience to know when you can bend those rules. And again, that's very, very persuasive. When I think of these 3 characteristics, I kind of feel they're best summed up perhaps by Matt's. Matt's, I've heard him speak a couple of times now, and it's not always that easy sometimes, because I know he has a bit of struggle sometimes with English. But his kind of genuineness, his selflessness of like, just wanting to make our lives fun is very convincing. And this is not to say that I've walked away blindly from his presentation saying like he was absolutely right. But I'm more likely to consider his ideas. They stick in my head longer. I go away and I'm still thinking an hour or 2 later about some of the things he said, because I find him very persuasive. Code grooming is a fun one that you will see. I guarantee you will see this in a large percentage of presentations. This is akin to monkeys picking fleas off each other. We use these common images. If I was to show this to someone non-technical, had no Ruby experience, they would probably have absolutely no idea what any of those pictures meant. Maybe then cat, maybe that's a little generic. So this idea of by throwing these things into your presentation, having some common picture, some common theme, meme, again, it connects us all. It shows you that I'm one of you. It shows you that we share something in common. Again, it's about sometimes humor, about kind of making you laugh, because again, in a positive state, you're more likely to pay attention, you're more likely to listen to what someone is saying. But it's also, again, about persuasion, about you're more likely to listen to me if I'm one of you. The final 3 things I want to talk about is a very simple idea, but a very powerful way of how you can be better at persuading in discussions. So Aristotle divided these 3 types of argument: forensic, epidectic, and deliberative. She okay?
She's gonna argue about it.
She okay? So forensic was about the past tense, about talking about things in the past. Epidectic, talking about things in the present, and deliberative, talking about things in the future. Now, it's interesting. These three different tenses have very different outcomes and effects of a conversation. If we're talking about the past, we're often talking about blame. Why did you break that thing? In the present, we're usually talking about values. This is often in kind of the politics of, what are your values? What do you feel about this issue? And the future is where choices are made. So topics or kind of conversations that tend to stick in the past tend to exit in some form of punishment. Again, this is why Aristotle talked about this, about the judicial system and how this very much fits with like a crime. Talk about the past, talk about the facts, talk about what happened, and then decide someone did something wrong, there's some type of punishment. The present, talking about either bonding or separating. You either agree with my ideals or you don't, and we leave. The future, where the payoff is. These three very simple tenses are a very effective way of helping make a conversation more productive, controlling the conversation. So often using the past and the present tense is about building up evidence, about talking about things that you feel can happen, things that have happened. And switching to the future is where you have choices, where you make things happen. So it's often a case of if you're stuck in the past, everyone's arguing about how bad the system was. Switching to the future tense of, okay, that was bad, but what can we do next? Switching to the future tense enables us to actually talk about options, to make positive outcomes from this discussion. A really good example of this, again, I said I do quite a bit of work on Cucumber, and someone wrote a big blog post kind of saying how terrible Cucumber was and no one should ever use it. And I kind of rolled up my sleeves, and I've been reading all this rhetoric stuff, and I was like, okay, I'm going to identify all the fallacies and just analyze it, and I think I spent like an entire afternoon writing like a massive essay. And then one of my colleagues and friends wrote a kind of a post after that, and he absolutely nailed it. He got this idea of tenses and also some powerful aspects of rhetoric. So he started in the past. He conceded on a small issue, like, yeah, you're right, sometimes this tool can be quite hard to use. So again, that's positive. Positive emotions more likely to lead to a kind of persuasion and having, I guess, a good discussion. And then making his point, moving to the present of saying, like, actually, yeah, but I do think you're wrong. I think this could be the case. And then moving to the future. Why don't you go and check out this open source project? They've got a really good thing here. And why don't you check out this? And why don't you check out that? Kind of giving someone escape routes. Again, this is a slight side issue, but when you're having a discussion with someone and you have a disagreement, you always need to provide escape routes for the other person or for yourself. So providing kind of evidence of, why don't you go look at that? Why don't you think about that? Why don't you look at that? Maybe you should look at that sort of thing. It's a very effective way of controlling tense and using little aspects of rhetoric to produce a much more constructive response to someone's blog post. And it was 10 times the comment in about 4 or 5 lines, so it was very effective communication. The medium is a difficult one because I know we do a lot of remote working, especially in the US, as I know is more common. We have all these kind of mediums, Twitter, Basecamp, Facebook, Pivotal, GitHub, so many different ways of communicating. And to me, this is the root cause of most communication problems I've seen. So the human face is supposedly capable of around 5,000 expressions. But more importantly than that, you can instinctively tell something about a person's expression. You can instantly feel that they're angry, they're happy, and you can also see what's coming next. In this example, you can see I'm not very happy. You can kind of see the emotions going to go into me screaming, and it will continue. This is some research from the Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, I think, where he actually looked into how instinctively we can tell and respond to people when we can see their faces. Being able to see someone's face is a very powerful aspect of communicating effectively. And if we're stuck using Skype IM, I've seen some hideous arguments over Skype, and you're always stuck in this problem of the words you express. When someone reads them, it's only the way they hear them in their head, and that is just open for miscommunication. It's such a common problem, and I know there's a lot of issues with having to do remote work and balancing these things, and you can do it effectively, but it's just bearing in mind that not underestimating how powerful it is just to see someone's face and have a face-to-face discussion, even if it's over Skype. So just to sum up some of the ideas I've talked about here, think about the goals that you want from a discussion. Think about what you want to get out of it. As I said, like, if you really want to be persuasive, you actually need to plan and think about what you want out of this. Think about the argument tense. Think about using the past and the present to build evidence and trying to switch to the future for the payoff. You have emotion, character, and logic, all forms that can be used in a persuasive argument. Being able to identify when someone is using them, being able to identify fallacies is a very important part of having a good discussion. Time and medium, we looked at medium. Time, I haven't really had much to cover, but time is a fascinating one. There's examples of Mussolini used to never speak in an entire meeting until the very end of the meeting. So it got to the point where everyone would have these big discussions, and then they would all turn and look at him, and he would say, like, no, sort of thing. And this was before he was like the powerful figure and was actually in charge. It was just speaking at the end. Often kind of there was a lot of arguments, a lot of discussions. Kind of coming in as a fresh voice is actually a very powerful way of having a discussion and ending it. What is it? Hitler used to hold his meetings very, very late in the evening, so everyone would be very, very tired and hence much more likely to be persuaded. These are all evil things you should never do, by the way. I don't want to imply I'm telling you them. So I've given this talk a couple of times, and something really cool that I've seen a couple of companies do. There's this great list of logical fallacies. It's called, I'll tweet that as well. It's called yourlogicalfallacyis.com. There's this great poster you can just stick up in like your office, in the kitchen, and somewhere. And it's this kind of fun thing that actually rhetoric has kind of died in our education systems, especially in Europe. No one really teaches rhetoric very much. And some of these things are quite obvious, but actually just having them, people can scan through them. In fact, where I used to work, people kind of started to actually create exemptions when there was a pub night. Like a pub night, everyone's allowed to do this certain fallacy, just for the fun of it. So be persuasive in everything you do. The code you write should be persuasive about the design you're choosing, about why you're choosing this design. Remember that there's very important aspects of emotion that are getting missed when you're writing your code. Being wrong is very easy, but being wrong is another word for learning. Learning is actually quite useful. There's nothing wrong with being wrong. That's slightly cyclic. But I think one key thing to bear in mind is don't be wrong because you're using some fallacies, because you're overloading various things. Be wrong because your argument has some kind of, your idea has some fundamental problem with it, some issue that isn't working. Don't let it be all these other things we've discussed, all these kind of fallacies, all these kind of getting caught up in emotional, a kind of over-emotional side. Kind of focus on exactly trying to be as clear as possible in your idea and being being okay when it fails, when you're wrong, but be wrong in a constructive manner. Thank you very much.